So, relatively quickly, if Chad, do you need to go?
I'm gonna do one more.
Okay.
My name is Jacob Kincaid. I live in the 75th district. You guys have already talked about districts and how they've changed in gerrymandering, and I'm curious what a minority party can do to make the redistricting process more fair. Can the redistricting process ever be fair?
Trey and I can talk about this.
I would love to know everything.
No is the short answer.
Okay.
Okay. We before I got there, and I'm now, since George left, only in my third year, the longest serving guy up here. So that's something. But anyhow, the Democratic caucus, along with the Senate caucus, no, was it just us? We took them to court. We took them to court. It cost us a lot of money. We took them to court. We won. It got appealed. It made it all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, basically, I'm surmising here, Trey, Supreme Court said, yes, the maps are gerrymandered, but the Kentucky Constitution does not specifically say you cannot gerrymander. Therefore, it's not against the law. Is that pretty good, Trey?
That's correct, yeah. So I testified in Franklin Circuit Court to defeat these maps. Got cross-examined by the Republican Attorney General's office and sat up there for multiple hours getting drilled. We had the same ruling in Franklin Circuit Court that said these maps are among the most gerrymandered in the country. The Kentucky Constitution does not prohibit gerrymandering. It says you can't split counties, you can't put more than 2 counties together, and you can't take a piece of a county and put it to make a district. They did that. The court didn't rule on it. They just said that there's nothing in the Constitution that says you can't gerrymander. We appealed to the Supreme Court. Our Senate caucus chose not to. Only Reggie Thomas voted against their map. And if you've seen the Fayette County Senate map, it is Reggie's district, and then every county around it takes a piece. We call it the wheel and spoke. So they chose not to work with us. The party and the House caucus appealed and went to the Supreme Court. Justice Keller wrote a very scathing dissent. She was the only one who dissented and said, these maps are terrible. These maps are clearly unconstitutional. This is not what the founders intended, and they are meant to rig the system in perpetuity. The other members of the court said, yes, they're gerrymandered, but we can't do anything about it.
What year?
That was April. I testified in April of 2022. Judge Wingate waited until basically the day after the 2022 elections when we ran under those maps to say they're not they are constitutional. We appealed to the Supreme Court immediately. That ruling happened in September of 2023. Chad and I drove to Central City that night on a recruitment meeting, and yeah, we commiserated about that the whole day.
So the short answer is no. Sorry, it stinks. That's the space that we're in. It'll take a constitutional amendment. We filed
Or a new court.
nonpartisan, like redistricting committees. Of course, they're not going to hear that. You know, Adam and Gabe both want to say something on this. I have a family engagement I need to get to, but I do want to say one thing about a couple of other bills before I leave. I think one of the most egregious bills that we had this cycle was Senate Bill 89. And if you weren't following that closely, it's going to greatly reduce the protections that we had in place at the state level for our drinking waters, for our groundwaters, and well water cisterns. I mean, just it's an attack on the health and safety of our people who may not live in an area where they've got a great water district who is going to filter and clean up that water. And it's going to cost us here in Lexington, who are going to be downstream of those pollutants, because our Kentucky American Water will have to treat that water. They'll have to use more chemicals. It'll cost more. It'll make our water rates go up. But the argument they had for that bill and the argument they had for the OSHA bill and for all these other things is that, oh, the federal government, their definitions are going to be fine. It's going to be okay because surely if the EPA or the federal OSHA, if they're in place, their definitions are going to be fine. And they did that despite knowing what they're doing in Washington right now is to continuously to lower and chip away at the standards of the safeties that we have in place, even at the federal level. So the hypocrisy is so rampant within the majority party to say, well, we're gonna leave it to the state level, or we want states' rights, or we want local rights, except for when it doesn't suit our interest, then we're gonna defer to the federal government. They just keep changing their mind. You know, I've been in public service for a long time. They used to make fun of John Kerry for flip-flopping. Well, they're flip-flopping all over the place depending on which election cycle it is. So, you know, Senate Bill 89, and I think it was House Bill 398, which was the OSHA, the workers' OSHA bill. You know, those bills are gonna make our people less safe. And they're saying that the federal government's gonna take care of it as we're laying off a third of the federal workforce. It's just not possible. So their reasoning and their arguments don't make sense, and I don't even think they believe them. They're just listening to Alec and these other people. But I do want to thank you all for coming today. I want to thank you for your participation in the process. We drastically need, I mean, I look at it in this audience and I know probably half of you guys personally, and that's good, but that's also a little disappointing because we need more fresh faces. We need new people to be engaged and be a part of this process. Please urge your neighbors who are just talk to you in the backyard about how upset they are. They may send you a social media thing, that they've got to get involved. They have to. Today, now is the time to stand up, and if we're not gonna fight back now, when? It is time to get in the fight, get on the front lines, and love your neighbors as yourself, and get out there and let's do it, guys.